I worked at a small pub out in the countryside, where the days seemed to stretch on in the same quiet rhythm. The regulars came in, ordered their drinks, and exchanged pleasantries, and I kept the place running smoothly. Most days, it felt like any other job, unremarkable routine. But then, there was her. She started coming in a few months ago, this woman who seemed older than me, but not by much. She had this kind of presence about her, something magnetic. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first, but I noticed that when she was around, everything felt different. Her eyes would always find me, even when I was talking to someone else, and I couldn't help but feel an uneasy awareness every time our paths crossed. At first, she was warm, friendly. Her smile was genuine, and she had a way of making me feel seen, like I mattered. But that changed over time. Slowly, she started to grow more distant. I couldn't quite figure it out. One minute, we'd have a laugh over something trivial, and the next, she'd pass by me without so much as a word. It was confusing. I didn't know if I had done something wrong, if I had crossed some invisible boundary, or if I was just reading too much into it. But the tension between us kept building. I became self-aware to the point where it was almost paralyzing. Every time she entered the pub, I felt my body tense, my mind racing. Was she looking at me? Was she mad? What had changed? I wanted to run, to escape from this uncomfortable dynamic, but at the same time, I felt this pull, this strange desire to stay. I wanted to understand why she had become distant, to bridge the gap that had formed between us. On the night it happened, I was working my last shift before leaving the pub for good. I had been thinking about her all night, about her eyes, the way she watched me sometimes, the way I couldn't shake this feeling that there was something left unsaid between us. It was my final night, and I couldn't get her out of my head. I tried to focus on the work at hand, but every time she entered the room, I felt this jolt of energy between us, like an invisible thread pulling me toward her. As the evening wore on, I noticed that she was sitting at the bar, quietly sipping her drink. Her usual warmth was gone, replaced by a distant expression, like she was lost in thought. It felt wrong, seeing her like that. I felt this burning need to do something, to bridge the gap, to reach out before it was too late. I had to know what was going on, even if I didn't fully understand what I was feeling. I left the bar for a moment to take a break and walk around the back of the building to get some fresh air. The restroom was located outside, and as I was heading back, I ran into her. She was walking back toward the back entrance, her eyes catching mine just as she looked up. For a moment, it felt like time slowed down. We stopped in our tracks, and I felt this strange mix of anxiety and anticipation. My heart was racing, my thoughts jumbled. What was happening? Why was this moment so intense? I don't know what possessed me, but something inside me snapped. I couldn't just let this feeling linger. I stepped forward and reached for her wrist gently, pulling her toward me, as if drawn by some unseen force. We stood there, just the two of us, locked in this silent exchange, staring into each other's eyes. I could see the change in her expression. Something softened in her gaze, but it was still unclear. Was it curiosity? Was it something else? The words came out before I could stop myself. "Tell me you want me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but I felt the weight of the moment in those words. There was no going back. Her eyes flickered, and then her lips parted, as if a quiet confession was on the edge of escaping. She didn't say anything immediately, but I saw it in her eyes, the unspoken desire, the longing that had been hidden behind the coldness. She leaned in slightly, her breath quickening, and the air between us grew thicker. The tension was unbearable, and I felt myself drawn to her, closer and closer, until I couldn't stop myself. I whispered, "Tell me, you don't want anyone else to have me." "I don't want anyone else to have you," she whispered back, and in that moment, Everything seemed to fall away. I pushed her against the wall, my hand resting on her shoulder as I leaned in, ready to kiss her. The world outside seemed to disappear, and for a heartbeat, it was just the two of us, suspended in time. But then, just as our lips were about to meet, a voice interrupted us. One of the high school workers, who was assigned to take out the trash, walked past us. He didn't see anything, but the moment was ruined. I pulled back immediately, feeling both embarrassed and frustrated. We exchanged a brief look, and without a word, we both turned and walked back inside. She went back to serving, and I returned to my duties, but my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about her. I didn't know what had just happened between us, but I knew I couldn't just forget it. The evening passed slowly after that, but my mind was racing with thoughts of what had just happened. I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, the way her eyes had softened, the tension that had built between us, the almost electric connection that had sparked in that instant. I had taken a step I never thought I'd take, and now I was left wondering what it meant. Had I misread the situation? Was it just a fleeting moment of impulse for both of us, or was there something deeper there? I couldn't focus on anything. Every time I looked at her, I saw that brief, intense connection flash before my eyes. My heart raced whenever she crossed my path, and I found myself retreating into my own thoughts. I didn't know if I was excited, nervous, or both. She was older, married, with children, and yet I couldn't seem to push away the thought of her. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't help it. What was happening? Why was I thinking about her so much? The pub was quieter now, the usual bustle of the evening slowing down as people began to leave. The other servers were outside on their smoke breaks, and the few remaining patrons were finishing their drinks, preparing to head home. I found myself back behind the bar, trying to keep myself busy with little tasks that didn't really matter. I was cleaning glasses, wiping down the counter, but all I could think about was her. The image of her in that moment, standing there, her lips parted slightly as she whispered those words to me, kept flashing in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she had looked at me, how different she seemed in that moment. I knew she was married. Her husband had come in earlier that evening, sat down at one of the tables, and ordered a meal. He was the kind of guy who seemed content, unaware, enjoying his dinner without a care in the world. I hated myself for even thinking about her this way, but every time I saw him sitting there, so relaxed, so comfortable in his world, it made my stomach churn. How could she be so far removed from him, yet so close to me, in the space between us that felt electric? I didn't know what to make of any of it. I knew I should have stayed away, should have kept my distance. She was married, and I had no business feeling the way I did. But it was hard to push away these feelings when she seemed to be the one to blur the lines. She wasn't just any woman. She was someone who had captured my attention in a way that made it impossible for me to ignore her. Even though I knew it was wrong, there was something in the way she looked at me that made me question everything. Later that evening, while I was refilling ice behind the bar, I saw her again. The pub was quieter now, the last few patrons enjoying their final drinks of the night. She was there by herself, standing behind the counter. The other servers had gone outside, and I was left alone to do the mundane tasks. She was just standing there, seemingly lost in thought, and I couldn't help but feel like this was my chance. I walked over to her, trying to act casual, though every nerve in my body was on edge. I had no idea what I was going to say, but I couldn't let the moment pass. She had become this enigma in my life, someone I couldn't get out of my head. I started talking to her, asking her how she was doing, trying to break the tension that had built up over the past hour. But as we spoke, I felt the pull between us again, stronger this time, like we were the only two people in the room. The conversation felt natural enough, but underneath it all, I knew there was something else, something unspoken that neither of us dared to acknowledge. I leaned in slightly, my hand brushing against the back of her hand as I reached for the ice scoop. It wasn't intentional, but it felt like the kind of thing you do when you want to see if the other person will react. She didn't pull away. In fact, her body seemed to relax just a little, and I couldn't help but notice the way she glanced at me, her eyes lingering on mine for just a moment too long. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but in that instant, I felt like the space between us closed just a little bit more. It was in that moment, as we stood there in the dim light of the bar, that I made a decision. I wasn't sure if it was the right one, but I felt it deep within me. I couldn't go another day without knowing whether there was something real between us, or if it was just my mind running wild. It was my last night at the pub, and I wasn't sure what the future held. But I couldn't leave without knowing. As I finished filling the ice, I stood there, still next to her, my pulse racing. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending that everything was fine, that I wasn't thinking about her, about what might happen between us. The weight of it all hung in the air, thick and heavy. She didn't say anything, but I felt the tension rising again, that pull between us that was undeniable. The other servers came back inside, laughing and joking as they returned from their break, and I knew I had to step back. I had to return to my work, to keep up the facade of normalcy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The night was winding down, but I felt like I was just getting started. The night slowly dragged on, and as the last of the patrons trickled out, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on me. I had come into work that evening thinking it would be like any other shift, but the moments with her, our brief exchange, that quiet connection we shared, kept replaying in my mind. Every time I tried to focus on the task at hand, my thoughts would return to her, to the way she looked at me, the way her presence seemed to fill the space between us with something unspoken, something powerful. The clock ticked down, and it felt as if the minutes stretched into hours. My boss, oblivious to my internal turmoil, asked me to help out with a few closing tasks. I nodded absently, going through the motions as I wiped down counters and checked the stock. But my thoughts were far from the mundane tasks I was performing. She was still there, etched into my mind, and I couldn't seem to shake her from my thoughts. How would you feel if your partner hid their affair for months or even years? Write in the comments. I kept asking myself, was I imagining it? Was it just a passing moment? Or was there something more to the way we had connected, something that both of us had felt but were too afraid to acknowledge? Despite everything, I knew I couldn't act on these impulses. She was married. She had kids. The reality of her situation made it clear that any thought of pursuing anything beyond a passing glance was a terrible idea. And yet, the pull was undeniable. It was a magnetic force, one that I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. I was trapped in a whirlwind of desire, guilt, and confusion, all mixed together in a tangled mess of emotions I couldn't seem to sort out. She was leaving, I knew. Her husband had already finished his meal and was getting ready to leave. The pub had emptied, and the lights were dimming as we prepared to close up. But then she came back into the room, and I was left standing there, watching her walk toward the door. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw it, the flicker of something behind her gaze. Was it curiosity? Was it something more? She didn't say anything, but there was a shift, something palpable between us that I couldn't quite describe. I felt a surge of adrenaline rush through me, pushing me to act, to make a move before she walked out of my life for good. I followed her, my footsteps quiet but determined. She was at the door, preparing to leave, and I felt the weight of the moment settle on me. I was standing at a crossroads, unsure of whether I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life or something that could change everything. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached her, and I knew that if I didn't say something now, I would never get the chance again. I walked up to her, and for the first time that night, I spoke to her without hesitation. Hey, I know this might sound strange, but I don't want to leave without saying goodbye. It's my last night here, and I feel like I need to say something. She stopped, her expression unreadable. For a moment, there was silence between us, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. She didn't respond right away, but her eyes softened slightly, as though she was considering my words. She took a step closer, and I felt the space between us close just a little bit more. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the tension building, thick and heavy, hanging in the air around us. I hesitated, but only for a second. I took a deep breath, then spoke again, this time with more conviction. I don't want to leave without telling you that I think you're amazing. You've been on my mind since the first time I saw you, and I couldn't leave without letting you know that. Her face softened, but I could see a flicker of something else in her eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or a quiet awareness of what was happening. She didn't pull away, and for a brief moment, it seemed like time stood still. I reached out, almost instinctively, and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. The simple gesture felt like a declaration, one that said everything I had been too afraid to admit. We stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other. The weight of her marriage, her family, all of that was still there, but it seemed to fade into the background for just a second. It was as if the world around us didn't matter, only the two of us in that small space, caught in this strange, undefined moment. I didn't know what was going to happen next. I didn't know if she felt the same way, if this was just a fleeting moment of desire that would disappear by morning. But in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't leave without kissing her. I leaned in slowly, my breath mingling with hers, and for a second, I felt like I was falling, like the ground beneath me had vanished. Then, in that breathless moment, our lips met. It wasn't a passionate kiss, but it was enough to feel the connection between us, enough to acknowledge that this was real, at least for now. But just as quickly as it had begun, it ended. A sound from behind us, the noise of the back door opening, the echo of footsteps, cut through the moment. I pulled away, my mind racing, my pulse quickening. It was as if everything had come crashing down all at once. Her eyes widened, and we both froze, caught in the act. She stepped back, and I knew it was over. There was no going back now, no way to undo what had just happened. She turned, not saying anything, and left without another word. I stood there, frozen in place, trying to process everything that had just unfolded. I had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure if I would regret it or not. All I knew was that I couldn't forget her, no matter how much I tried. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this moment, this kiss, would stay with me forever. The aftermath of what had happened lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. I couldn't believe it had actually happened. The kiss, the unspoken connection, the shared moment of intimacy, everything felt so surreal, and yet so real. I stood there for a while, staring at the door where she had just exited, trying to gather my thoughts. I should have stopped. I knew it was wrong, knew I was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But in that moment, I hadn't cared. In that moment, it had felt like the only thing that mattered was the pull between us, that undeniable tension that had been building for weeks. But now, as I stood in the quiet, empty pub, I felt a sense of dread creeping in. What had I done? What did this mean? And more importantly, what would happen next? I had no answers, just a feeling of guilt gnawing at me, a deep unease in the pit of my stomach. She was married. She had children. What had I been thinking? I didn't know if she felt the same way or if this had been some sort of mistake. Maybe she had acted on impulse, just like me, without considering the consequences. Or maybe she had been struggling with the same feelings I had been, unsure of what to do with the chemistry between us. But either way, it didn't change the fact that I had crossed a boundary, and I had no idea how she was going to react. I finished cleaning up, going through the motions of closing down the pub, but everything felt different now. The place seemed colder, more distant. The usual hum of background noise, the clinking of glasses, the chatter of customers, was gone, leaving only the haunting silence. I couldn't stop replaying the kiss, wondering what it meant, wondering if I had ruined everything. I knew I had to leave. I needed to get out of there, clear my head, but I couldn't. My body was moving mechanically, doing the tasks I had done 1,000 times before, but my mind was elsewhere, consumed by the memory of her and what we had just shared. What was she thinking now? Was she regretting it? Was she angry? I had no way of knowing, no way of understanding what this meant for us, if there even was an us to begin with. As I locked up for the night, I saw her car parked outside. She had been gone for a few minutes, but there she was, her headlights casting a long shadow against the pavement. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I go to her? Should I apologize? Or should I just walk away and never look back? I couldn't bring myself to walk away. I had to know. I had to understand what had just happened. I approached her car, my heart racing in my chest. I knocked on the window gently, and she looked up, startled. When she saw me, her expression softened, but there was a guardedness in her eyes that I couldn't ignore. She rolled down the window slightly, not saying anything at first. I could tell she was trying to figure out what to say, just as I was. I stood there, unsure of what to say. The words didn't come easily. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand, I said, my voice shaky. I don't know what happened, but I don't want things to be awkward between us. I just want to understand what this means. She was quiet for a long moment, and I couldn't read her face. It was like she was trying to make sense of everything, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and steady. We both know what this means, she said softly, but it doesn't change anything. I'm married. I have a family. This can't happen again. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known the truth all along, but hearing it from her mouth made it so much more real. I had crossed a line, and she wasn't willing to let me pull her into something that could destroy everything she had worked for. And I respected that. But at the same time, I felt this crushing disappointment. The connection we had shared, the kiss, it had meant something, at least to me. But now, it was clear that it was just a fleeting moment, something that couldn't last. I understand, I said, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done it. I trailed off, unable to explain the whirlwind of emotions that had taken over me. She nodded, her eyes sad but resolute. I don't want to hurt anyone, least of all my family. We both have to move on from this. And just like that, the tension between us seemed to dissipate. She rolled the window up slowly, and I stood there for a moment longer, watching her drive away. My heart was heavy, but there was a sense of finality in the air now. The brief spark that had existed between us was over. She had made her choice, and I had to respect it. I turned and walked back toward the pub, my footsteps echoing in the empty parking lot. The cool night air hit me, and I felt the weight of everything settling in. I had let myself get caught up in something that wasn't real, something that had been built on fleeting moments and desires that could never be fulfilled. And now, I was left to pick up the pieces of my own mistakes. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would I ever see her again? Would I ever be able to forget the way her lips had felt against mine, the way her eyes had locked with mine in that brief moment of connection? Or would I have to carry this memory with me, always wondering what could have been, but knowing that it would never be more than a fleeting, impossible dream.